Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Deschutes Public Library online programming. I'm Laurel Westendorf. I'm part of the community relations team, and today we're hearing from author and hiking guru William Sullivan as he takes us on a tour of new or dramatically changed trails in the area between Salem and Bend, featured in the newly released 5th edition of his guidebook, 100 Hikes in the Central Oregon Cascades. William Sullivan is the, William Sullivan is the author of 5 novels and a dozen books about Oregon, including the popular 100 Hike series, Hiking Oregon's History, and Oregon Favorites. His journal of a 1,000-mile hike he took across Oregon, called Listening for Coyote, was chosen by the Oregon Cultural Heritage Commission as one of Oregon's 100 books, the 100 most significant books in the state's history. Many of his guidebooks and novels are in the Deschutes Public Library's collection and will be available when we reopen. For purchasing his books, please check local bookstores in Central Oregon that are currently doing curbside pickup. We would like to note that at this time in spring of 2020, the national forest we will be discussing, including the Deschutes and Willamette National Forest areas, have closed developed recreation areas, including trailheads and campgrounds, due to health risks associated with COVID-19. Please check the National Forest website for up-to-date information on closures and other state guidelines on essential travel. Thank you so much for joining us, Bill.
It's my pleasure, yeah. And as you can see, we're not actually on the trail, but rather are doing this sort of online so that you can get ready for the hiking season and ideally skip a lot of the problems that have turned up for people who really enjoy recreation, which would be things like, limits on where you can go and permits and fire damage. And so I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about myself, I suppose. I'm probably best known for the book that Laurel mentioned, the Listening for Coyote, the story of this 1,000-mile hike I took across Oregon. I wanted to visit all of the wilderness areas in the state and naively thought the easy way to do this would be to walk through them all at once. So I hiked from the westernmost point of the state at Cape Blanco in one summer to the easternmost point at Hell's Canyon, and along the way kept this journal of all my adventures. And so down here is where I was held at gunpoint by marijuana growers. And here I poisoned myself with mushrooms, another bright idea when you're alone in the woods, and wound up hiking miles a day through Hell's Canyon, trying to outrun these October snowstorms. And you know what amazes me is that to this day that people read this book and it makes them want to go hiking. You think it would scare them away. My other adventure memoir is the true story of the log cabin that my wife and I built by hand. And I know a lot of us have dealt with cabin fever here as we're sort of trapped at home with this virus problem, but we did this on purpose for years. Out in the Coast Range, built this cabin by hand with nothing but a crosscut saw and an axe. We still live there in the summers. I have a typewriter. I've written most of my novels out there. And so, you know, cabin fever has an upside too. But then some of the novels I've written are murder mysteries, a whole series of them. And this one is sort of the first in a series I've done of mysteries that are set partly in Oregon. This is stuff that you could read when you're trapped at home or take with you on a camping trip. This one is about a missing Einstein formula for quantum gravity that turns up in a violin case in an attic in Oregon and causes no end of mischief. The characters in this book were so popular, I brought them back to deal with D.B. Cooper, which of course is the great unsolved mystery of the Northwest. What happened to this guy who parachuted with $250,000 and got away with it? The only unsolved hijacking in the history of the FBI. But if Cooper's alive, he'd be in his 70s. So in my novel, I have him living in Portland in plain sight, and he's got a problem. He's being blackmailed. People start dying, and my detective has to come in and unravel the whole mess, which winds up involving voodoo donuts and the Russian mafia. And the same detective and his autistic daughter, who cracks the case with her sixth sense, comes back to deal with the Rajneeshis when they come back. This is another of my mysteries with that Oregon flair. Of course, this Bhagwan was a guru from India who brought thousands of people to build a city in the Eastern Oregon desert and got into all kinds of trouble. But he's been dead for 27 years. However, he always said he'd be reincarnated. And so the premise for my novel is that they now claim he has. They say he's actually a 26-year-old barista in a Portland coffee shop. And so my detective has to figure out what's really behind all of that. And then a series of historical novels set in Scandinavia about the Viking Age. My wife is Danish, and the first in this series is about the start of the Viking Age in Norway, and the new one just came out in the middle of the Viking Age with Harald Bluetooth in Denmark. Harald Bluetooth was not merely a wireless technology, he was the Viking king of Denmark who conquered England because the English king had murdered his daughter. And each of these books is based around the actual excavation of a real Viking ship. And the goal is to show that the Vikings were not merely barbarians as are portrayed by the English, but were actually traders and craftsmen and farmers and brought juries and democracy to England. And Oregon history is big with me too. I'm a 5th generation Oregonian, and the one on the left here, Hiking Oregon's history, is the human history of the state. 14,000 years of legends and stories and wagon train routes and gold mining ghost towns. And on the right is the natural history, floods, fires, earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis. So it's a scarier book, and a couple that cover the whole state, a guidebook for adventurers, the Atlas of Oregon Wilderness, and then the trips and trails. That's more what my kids call the wussy hiking guide. That's a little unfair. It's, they are typically easier, but it's all in color, and it has the hot springs and bed and breakfasts as well as the easier hikes. And then this one's month by month. And every month of the year, I recommend half a dozen appropriate things to do in that season. But today, what I want to take you on a tour of is new and changed trails in the Central Oregon Cascades, which is this whole big area I define sort of between Salem, Eugene, and Bend. And what's really changed here is that we are now required to have permits for some trails. There were some big fires. We have a problem with crowding, and we need to spread out a little bit. And yet we're still eager to find new trails. And so I want to start with a couple of new trails that avoid really most of those problems. And let's start right on the outskirts of Bend with the Trail. Now, about in 2012, Bend voters authorized $29 million to build a 30-mile trail all the way from Sun River to Tumalo. And they ran out of money before they actually finished that, but they got most of it done. And one of the new stretches is 3 miles from Tumalo State Park to a new nature reserve at Riley Ranch. And this is just a beautiful place. You can hardly believe you're this close to Bend. It feels so wild. You can start either at Riley Ranch on the left or Tumalo State Park on the right. I kind of prefer Tumalo. It's just a little bit wilder, that part of the canyon there. And after a mile, you get to this really cool catwalk across a rock slide. And then after a mile and a half, you get to the boundary of this Riley Ranch Nature Reserve. And from there on, you can't have dogs. So that's another reason you might start at Tumalo. If you really have to have a dog along, then you want to start at Tumalo. Without the dog, you can go on and do this canyon loop. Or if you start at Riley Ranch, there's no parking fee. It's free, but the trails are kind of wide and paved and no dogs. So let's start at Tumalo, where you do have to pay $5 to park. But it's, I think, worth it because the trail starts out really quiet and gorgeous along a glassy stretch of the Deschutes River. There are a couple of patches of private property that the trail crosses. These access was bought by this bond measure that makes it possible to get through there. Then they could have used dynamite to blast out the trail across this rock slide. It was a stroke of genius to build this catwalk across it because it's just fun and beautiful and more natural too. Then beyond where Tumalo Creek joins, above that, the Deschutes River is suddenly much smaller. It's just a creek. Most of the water's been drained for irrigation. And it's interesting to see how little is left at that point. But there are a number of access points. You can only go to the river at these little marked side trails. And then you pass a couple of cabin ruins that belonged to O.B. Riley. And it turns out that O.B. Riley was not really an obstetrician. He was actually a rancher in the area, and his huge ranch there was in danger of being developed for just suburbia. But this bond measure really saved a big chunk of it here. And it's a nice place to go in spring when the Oregon grape is blooming along the trail. This is our state flower, Oregon grape. And if you do start at the Riley Ranch Nature Preserve, they've got a modern big parking lot and all of that, but you can't have dogs, as I said. And the trails are a little wider and more graveled or paved. And then you get to a viewpoint overlooking the canyon where you can see that Bend is encroaching on this area. And it really was a great stroke of fortune and wisdom that Bend voters authorized the money to save this. A new trail with no permits required and no fire damage, and actually not even that crowded considering how close it is to Bend. If you want an even less crowded trail that goes along the Deschutes River, another new one, that would be Wildcat Canyon. And you're thinking, how can there be a trail along the Deschutes River in a canyon this gorgeous that I don't know about and that's new? Well, it's part of this big triangle of public land between Bend and Sisters and Redmond. And about half the land in that huge triangle is Bureau of Land Management. So it belongs to us, the people. And the BLM has built about a dozen trailheads in this area with facilities and trails and all that. The problem is they're boring. Most of the trails just wander around through the sagebrush and the juniper. They have trails for mountain bikes and horses, but they're mostly used by dog walkers. And even they complain that even their dogs get bored. But one of them is particularly neat. And if you start at this sort of smaller parking area, which is only for hikers, then in a loop, you see the best part of this new trail along the Deschutes River. And if you are on a mountain bike or have a horse, then you have to start at the large official trailhead and then have your choice. There's a mountain bike route and there's a separate route for horses. Hikers can do either one. And actually, if you want a longer hike, it's smart to start at the official trailhead where they got bathrooms and all that. But again, no permits, no fees. And you start out through junipers and sagebrush. It's true, but they're interesting as well. Some of the oldest trees in Oregon might be these junipers. And they're covered with this yellow lichen, this Lotharia lichen, which is pretty but very poisonous. And the trees often are into this dish rag format as they grow. And it's thought that this is a reaction to wind, that trees that grow straight, have straight grain, actually are more susceptible to breaking in the wind. And they're actually stronger if they spiral. But no one knows exactly why they're spiraling one direction rather than the other. So mystery there. And if you go in spring, this is a time to look for sand lilies. These just come out of the sand. You'd find them at the Deschutes River Trail by O.B. Riley Ranch as well. And then you get to the canyon overlook here of the Deschutes River. And here's a good place to look for golden eagles. Now in Western Oregon, the eagles are mostly bald eagles. They're fish that eat fish. I mean, they're birds that eat fish. But in Eastern Oregon and Central Oregon, they're mostly golden eagles, and they don't eat fish so much. They eat rodents. And here what they're hunting are pack rats. And the pack rats live in these crevices and caves in the rim rock there. You can sometimes see patches of white where they come out to pee. And that's actually when they're most at risk. That's when an eagle can swoop down and snatch them. So even though you have really the Redmond Airport across the way, you don't see it. You could imagine you are really miles from anywhere. It's another new trail, close to Bend, that doesn't have a problem with permits and all of that. And I want to take you to another overlooked trail in a place you would otherwise never go, and that would be Salem. Now, I grew up in Salem, so I know just how dull that town can be. I mean, you drive by on the freeway and see the golden man on top of the Capitol, and you think, well, one of these days, maybe I should go see that, and maybe not. But they've just built a new bridge from downtown Salem to two islands in the Willamette River that are now a wildlife refuge, and it now makes Salem actually a worthwhile stop. with this new bridge that takes you over to Minto Island and Brown Island. They've actually merged to the mainland after a flood in 1860, but there were originally two islands. There's a number of different loops you can take. Both of these islands had seen a lot of abuse over the years. Brown Island on the left was the county landfill. Minto Island on the right had industrial sludge ponds from a paper mill in downtown Salem, but that's all been cleaned up, and it's now doing quite nice. You start out on the waterfront in Salem at the waterfront, where they have a carousel, and for $1.50, kids can ride the ponies. And then the trail itself, the bridge, starts right by this giant statue, a globe of the earth. And you think, well, that's a cool piece of art, but actually it's more industrial garbage. This was the acid tank for the paper mill before they put that sludge out across the river. And when they shut down the paper mill, they turned it into a piece of art by having school children decorate tiles all over it, and that's fun. And then over the bridge you go, footbridge to what used to be these sludge ponds and now is a wildlife refuge. And the island, Minto Island, is named for John Minto. He was upstanding legislator, the pioneer for whom Minto Lake and Minto Pass are named in the Mount Jefferson wilderness. He almost ran for governor, but the island right next to him was occupied by Whiskey Brown, who is exactly the opposite kind of pioneer. This was a drunk who lived in a tree house and raised tobacco and distilled moonshine to sell to the Indians. When the flood of 1860 combined these two islands, these two pioneers were suddenly thrown together, and it's amazing they didn't kill each other. Anyway, trails are paved at the start. They're in Minto Island. When you get to Brown Island, they're back to more natural looking trails. And on the way back, you can cross a footbridge over what used to be the Willamette River. The whole river used to flow between these islands there, and now it is a slough where you're likely to see great blue herons and a lot of wildlife. And it's finally, a reason to stop in Salem. If you want to see even more birds, then take the first freeway exit south of Salem at Ankeny Hill, and that'll take you to the Ankeny Wildlife Refuge and a new nature center that they're opening. It'll be open in October, but the trails are ready now, even though this visitor center is not quite open yet. In this gigantic wildlife refuge just south of Salem includes more than a mile of boardwalks through these wetlands that all winter are just forests covered, buried in water, and bird blinds with views and stuff. And so that's actually a cool thing that you can do if you find yourself stuck in Salem. And now we're going back to trails closer to Bend and the problems with permits. Some of these trails had become so crowded, and it was just a handful. A few trails were so packed that there would be hundreds of cars at the trailhead and overflowing and parked illegally on the way up and up and down the highway, and people packed person to person and going up to there. And so this year, starting this summer, you have to have limited entry permits in advance for 19 of the most popular trailheads. And that includes this one here, the Green Lakes, where they only issue 80 permits a day for day users and 14 for overnight groups. And also Canyon Creek Meadows over by Sisters. This is a gorgeous meadow, right up against the mountains, but again, so crowded that it's now limited to 60 people a day and 5 overnight groups. And likewise, Tam MacArthur Rim, right up there on Broken Top, only 80 permits a day and 5 overnight permits. But you noticed I've mentioned only 3 here. Those are the 3 big ones that were so crowded that they had to do something because people were actually damaging these places. The 4th one that maybe was way too crowded was Jefferson Park. And this is another Shangri-La at the foot of this mountain, just wildflower meadows and lakes, and it's gorgeous. But it was getting a little crowded. It has another problem. It's not just that there were permits required now, but also there was a big fire. And they actually, in 2017 and 2018, a lot of the Central Oregon Cascades had big fires that really changed a lot of trails. And in this case, the fire completely burned the easy trail in, the Whitewater Trail into Jefferson Park. So 4 miles of that are just black. And it's coming back with a little bit of greenery, but and you have better views of the mountain, but everything that's brown on the lower part of this map was part of that 2017 burn that burned the trailhead and the first 4 miles, but it did not burn the Pacific Crest Trail or Jefferson Park. So if you hike through the burn, and they say that's what you have to do, you can still get there. Or there are 2 other ways into Jefferson Park. You can come in from the north, from Brightenbush Lake. That has its own problems. Or you can hike the South Brightenbush Trail, which has different problems. So let's look at these 3 ways into Jefferson Park. If you go in from the north on the Pacific Crest Trail from Brightenbush Lake, the trailhead actually starts on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation. And the tribe allows you to park there, but they don't actually encourage a lot of traffic. And the way they do that is by not maintaining the road to the trailhead. The access road has gotten worse and worse the last 2 miles. You can walk faster than you can drive. But it is legal to do. And then when you do the hike, you go over Jefferson Park Ridge on the way in, which means it's not only a little bit longer than going on Whitewater, but you lose 800 feet of elevation as you go into the park, which means you'll have to gain it back on the way out. Well, what about that 3rd route in, the South Brightenbush Trail? Well, it has 1,000 feet more elevation than the Whitewater Trail, and it's 1 mile longer. It's also rougher. It sees some horse use and is kind of eroded. You need to wear good boots so you don't twist your ankle, but then you do get up into these meadows, and they are glorious. I guess the problem really had always been the crowds and the permits. It's not, my favorite way to limit people, but in some places it makes sense, because here at Jefferson Park, there are only 28 legal campsites, each marked with a post. And if you try to camp somewhere else, they have rangers that are up there all summer, and they will tap you on the shoulder and tell you to go home. And that's just no fun. With the permit system, they only issue as many permits for overnight campers as there are actual campsites. So you're guaranteed a campsite. That is better. They also only issue as many day hike permits as there are actual parking spots at the trailhead. That's actually nice to be in a parking spot. So yeah, you do have to plan ahead a little bit. They issue about half the permits 1 week before the start date of your hike. So you can try to get them way in advance, or wait until exactly 1 week before you go and try to nab one then. Or you can do what I'm going to recommend. Don't go to these 19 places that were so crowded you have to have permits. Go somewhere else, like a free natural hot springs with no permits or crowd. Where is that possible in Oregon? And it's right actually next to the trailhead going up to Mount Jefferson. And already you're thinking, wait a minute, Brightenbush Hot Springs, isn't that private? Well, it's true, 1 square mile of land there is private, and they have a private hot springs there where you pay hundreds of dollars and you live in a yurt, and they feed you dinners of couscous and kale. But there's also a free natural hot spring outside that is public. And, for purposes of suspense, I'm not going to tell you where it is right away. And instead, I'm going to make you do a hike first, because I think you should earn the hot springs. So start over here at this guard station. It burned down years ago, but it's still a good parking lot and a good starting point for a hike up the South Brightenbush River. And right away, you cross a number of unofficial footbridges, which I'll show you in a second. And a good turnaround point is Roaring Creek, which doesn't have a bridge. You could get across it, but it's just a nice turnaround. On the way back, make sure you find South Brightonbush Gorge, a spectacular gorge that's not marked, and you really have to know where it is. And after that, then you get your hot springs hike, which is only a half mile, but it'll feel better if you've already done the other hike first. So let's do the hike. And here crossing the river, one of these unofficial footbridges. These were built by volunteers from the Brightonbush Hot Springs Resort. So they're not up to the federal Forest Service standards. One person at a time, sort of on your own. I think they're kind of fun. And then you get to Roaring Creek, which is this nice lunch spot. On the way back, just less than half a mile back, you can listen for the roar of the South Brightonbush Gorge, but you're not really going to find it. It's only 200 feet from the trail, and it's just pretty well hidden. There's no signs or anything. This is a you need a guidebook, or maybe have a GPS or I give you the GPS coordinates for that. And then you could find this cool little hidden gorge there. And then, yes, you get to go to the hot springs. And there are no signs at the trail, no signs on the way in, but it's a nice wide trail, and it takes you to a resort that was abandoned in the 1970s. Actually, I remember it as a child going hiking in there and thinking, wow, this is kind of run down and the pools are kind of slimy. And they haven't gotten better with age. They're still kind of slimy, but people have taken hoses and run the hot water down to natural pools by the river. And so you've got the hot springs, and you're out in the wild, and it is free, and it's not really crowded, and you don't have to have the permit problem. And here's another hike that avoids those problems, and I think has the next best view of Mount Jefferson after Jefferson Park. This is number 2. It's amazing, the view from Bugaboo Ridge. And Bugaboo Ridge is not actually in the Mount Jefferson wilderness, so it doesn't have any of those restrictions or permits or any of those problems. The reason it's not well known is because the trailhead is a little bit hidden. You have to know where to park. There's no sign there. The actual trailhead is 400 feet up a brushy side road. And then you set off through an old clear cut, but only briefly, and that's interesting too, past some big trees, and then a whole variety of meadows, different kinds of meadows on your way up. It's like one of the Iron Mountain, one of these very popular wildflower hikes where they have thousands of people going in June, late June and early July to see the wildflowers. The flowers here are better, and you won't have those crowds. It's actually closer if you're driving from Bend too. Then up to the top of Bachelor Mountain for a view. And no, this is not Mount Bachelor, not the ski area. This is the other Bachelor Mountain, the one over by Detroit. And so here's the hidden trailhead, which I think is an advantage. Behind that road out there is the actual road where you can park, and then you have to walk up this brushy road. You could drive and scratch your car. No one would do that. And then there's a real trailhead sign, and you head off through the woods, and you start off in some big woods with anemones that bloom in June. And then through this old clear cut that's regrowing, has views of the mountain and full of rhododendrons, past some big Douglas fir trees, and then the start of the meadows. This one has the red Indian paintbrush and Plectritis there. Here's a wet meadow that's just full of the purple larkspur and yellow monkey flower, and then rock gardens all the way up to the very summit of Bachelor Mountain, where there used to be a fire lookout, but the Forest Service burned it down in the 60s. And so there's just melted glass and rusty nails left from the lookout tower itself, but the view is still there. You are front row center, face to face with Mount Jefferson. Spectacular view, and my favorite wildflower hike in the whole Central Oregon Cascades now. And it's not crowded, and you don't have to deal with permits. Well, now here's one where it did have a fire, but it's been like 8-9 years, and it's time to go back. This is at Santiam Pass. It's behind the Hoodoo ski resort and the Big Lake campground. And the fire was about 8 years ago, and it was in a lodgepole pine forest. And it turns out lodgepole pines are actually really used to fire. They actually like fire. If the forest gets more than 80 years old, now they start to get pine beetles and stuff, and then it looks sickly. And the only way to get rid of the pine beetles is for a fire to come through. And so the lodgepole pine actually kind of encourage fire, and they do great at reseeding afterwards. And of course, then their trunks are popular with woodpeckers, and it brings back a lot of wildlife that you wouldn't otherwise. So here we're starting at Sandy Pass behind the Hoodoo ski area on a paved road, and it's about a 7-mile loop. And you can see there are some burned areas, but it's not entirely burned, and it's been 9 years. So, and you wind up with going back along Big Lake. Turns out that lodgepole pine have 2 different kinds of pine cones. I didn't know this till recently. One kind is just for 1 year and drops its seeds, and but the other kind are small, tough cones that do not open. They'll stay. You see them even on a dead tree after the tree's been dead for 40 years. Those ones are designed, they're sealed shut with pitch, and they will only open after a fire has gone through and melted the pitch, and then the cones slowly open and reseed after the fire. And that is why lodgepole pines come back so well after fire and then avoid the problem with pine beetles. And you will find some downed logs across the trail. You can step over them pretty easy, but there are a volunteer trail crews. The Scorpion crew out of Eugene has cleared this trail every 2 years. And when they do it, they clear 200 logs out of the way, cutting them by hand with crosscut saws. So thank them for having the trail cleared. They keep at it, but there will still be a few logs that you step over. And at the lakes themselves, the Patchins Lakes, the moisture in the lake protected the trees around them. So they're still green, and there's patches of green forest along the way. And then on the way back, you come back along Big Lake with views of Mount Washington and Hayrick Butte. So the Patchins Lakes, you don't need a permit for that unless you're backpacking, and then you do, but day hiking, no problem, off you go. And here's another one with the same deal. It's a waterfall near Sisters on Waichus Creek, up in the Three Sisters Wilderness. You don't need a day permit for this. If you're backpacking, you do, but it's not a place to backpack, really. This is an area that burned 12 years ago, and that's why the trail was closed for 10 years as they thought about how to rebuild this trail. And what they did was they made it a little bit longer, and it's actually nicer. It has better views of the Three Sisters now, and so you do start back a mile further or 1.5 miles than you used to, but it's an interesting route along the way. And you get to this viewpoint of a cliff, kind of a scary viewpoint actually, and then along the way you're going through the blackened snags, but we have a view here of South Sister, and the red flowers are fireweed, one of the pioneer plants after a fire. And here's this scary viewpoint where if you crawl out to the point there, you are literally overhanging a bend, a S-shaped bend of Waichus Creek, which, by the way, used to be called Squaw Creek, but it turns out that the word squaw is offensive to the native tribes, and is not very original either. Oregon has like 80 squaw creeks, so they've started renaming them, and this one they chose Waichus, which means a place to cross the water. And the waterfall, which used to be Squaw Creek Falls, is now Choosh Falls, which means water falls. Not very original either, really, but it's still more authentic. So past the cliff viewpoint, it gets greener because you're going into a box canyon, and that actually limited the fire. It couldn't get into that canyon. So it gets greener and greener till you get to the falls. And there, at the viewpoint, you almost wish the fire had burned it because the trees are growing up in the way of the view. You can scramble around and get views. You can continue on an unofficial trail, but for most people, this really is the turnaround point to a waterfall on a new trail that's opened up near Sisters that doesn't require a day hike permits. And now we're going to go to one that does. And this is up at McKenzie Pass. And yeah, McKenzie Pass burned a couple of years ago. And one of the places that burned is the Pacific Crest Trail that crosses there and heads up into the Three Sisters Wilderness. But they reopened that pretty quick because there's a lot of pressure on the Pacific Crest Trail, and it didn't burn the entire route. So you start there at McKenzie Pass at Lava Camp Lake in the burn, it's true, but after 1.5 miles, you leave it, and then you get to South Matthew Lake, a cute little lake, and you can make a 7-mile loop by coming back by a slightly larger lake, North Matthew Lake. So here we are starting out at McKenzie Pass, where it's pretty badly burned at first, but after 1.5 miles, you leave that behind. And we're getting a view down to North Matthew Lake, but first the trail takes you around, contouring over to South Matthew Lake. And this is on the Pacific Crest Trail, right at the crest of the mountains. It's a small lake, so the pressure on this lake for overuse was extreme. There are only 3 campsites at this lake. They're marked with a post, but people were like camping all over, and you could see some of the bare ground around this lake. So this is a place where the limited number of permits makes sense, because there really are only 3 campsites where you're not damaging the place, and then you'll be guaranteed a spot if you get the permit. Or you can hike on the loop over to North Matthew Lake, which is bigger and has this nifty island in it. It's a great place to take a bunch of teenagers, for example. They have 7 campsites here that are open to groups. And it's a great place to let kids run around because, it's kind of an enclosed valley there with a lava flow on one side and a hill on the other. And so they can run around and you can't get too lost. The lake gets kind of warm. You can swim out to this island, and yet it's not too deep. It's a cool place, and one where you really do want to have a permit so that you get one of the campsites and it's not then crowded. Now, why am I showing you Mount Bachelor? Well, if we're talking about new hikes in the Central Oregon Cascades, everyone knows this is a big ski resort. Well, yeah, in winter it is, but the ski resort is actually on public land. It's on Forest Service land. They operate with a special use permit there. And one condition of that permit is that they must maintain the original trail that goes up to the summit of Mount Bachelor that once led to a fire lookout that used to be up there. So this trail goes through the ski resort area without really seeing much of it. It's a really lovely mountain climb, close to Bend. And yeah, it's a mountain climb. I mean, it's a trail, but there are 100 switchbacks on the way up this thing. And if you start at the official trailhead, well, that's Sunrise Lodge, which is open in winter, but closed in the summer. And they have a gate there. And there might even be a no parking sign there, but there is no other trailhead at the current time. So yeah, you can park there. Eventually they want to move the trailhead over to West Village Lodge, which is open year round. And then they'll have a cutoff trail that goes through there, but they haven't built that trail yet. So in the meantime, you can start at either place. If you start at Sunrise Lodge, you go straight up the mountain. If you start at the West Village Lodge, I know what you're thinking already. You're thinking, wait a minute, that chairlift is open all year round. They run the Pine Mountain Express for summer tourists to go up to get views of the mountain up at the Pine Mountain Lodge. I could ride that halfway up the mountain and miss all that elevation gain. Well, that's sort of true, except it goes up the wrong side of the mountain. And to get to the trail up to the summit, you have to go downhill to get back to it. You save a little bit of elevation gain, a little bit of distance, but you also have to pay $18 to ride the chairlift up. So you're going to argue about this all the way up there. Do I stop at the no parking signs and hike the free trail up, or do I go to West Village Lodge and pay $18 a person to ride this chairlift and still wind up climbing a lot? Well, if you do ride the chairlift, they allow dogs on the chairlift. And that kind of amazes me. I think they'd better be like well-behaved dogs, because if they get nervous, it's a long ways down. But you get nice views riding up the chairlift. Most of the other people riding up in summer have mountain bikes, because they are going to be riding down underneath the chairlift, just going up and down all day. Well, your goal is going to be different. You're going to climb the mountain, and this requires going over to the trail that goes up to the summit. And then you kind of parallel the Summit Express chairlift, but the Summit Express chairlift does not go to the actual summit of Mount Bachelor. Only hikers really can go the extra third of a mile over to the real summit, and that's where the trail really goes. So you, as you hike up the mountain, you pass timberline, where the trees peter out, and the last trees, these struggling Krummholz, they're called. That's a German alpine word for crooked wood. They are white bark pines, and this is a tree that only grows at timberline on Oregon mountain tops, and it has 5 needles in a bundle. You can recognize it by that, but also because the branches are so limber that they can literally be tied in knots. You can actually do that. This is a survival strategy for the tree. They get blasted with horrific winter storms. Other trees would break, but the white bark pines just bend. They just go with the flow. More rock gardens with paintbrush as you go up, and lots of switchbacks. You can see the chairlift over there, but it's really not obtrusive. And up at the top, you wind up with this panoramic view out to Bend and Tumalo Mountain. And here you look down to that little blue dot in the building. Wait a minute, that's the Pine Marten Lodge. And my car is down in the trailhead parking lot down below there. And you're thinking, maybe I should shortcut. I could just go straight back. Don't do it. It's all lava and cliffs between here and there. You die. You have to go back the long way on the official trail. But then you've done a mountain climb, and you don't have to worry about the permits that are now required to climb the trail up South Sister, which was so heavily used that it really needed some way to limit it. So maybe Mount Bachelor instead. Now let's go over to the Cascade Lakes Highway. And this is one of these fairly crowded areas. Lots of the trails are in that list of 19 that are limited, but not the one to Koltes and Muskrat Lakes. And it's just a little bit farther than Elk Lake. And I actually had dropped it, put it at the back of my book for a few years because there was a fire, but it was 20 years ago, and it's only part of the way. It's pretty nice now. Koltes is actually an old Chinook jargon native word that means worthless. And that it's one of the few lakes on the Cascade Lakes Highway where that they allow power boats. So in summer, there's like water skiers zooming around on the lake. That's not really why they called it worthless, but it's true. You leave them behind after a mile when hiking around the lake, and you pass this camp where a lot of the power boaters like to go. And beyond that, it's pretty quiet. And then you strike off into the Three Sisters Wilderness, where you would need an overnight permit if you're going to backpack, but if for day hikes, no problem, and off to a cute little Muskrat Lake. So here's the beach after a mile. This would be a turnaround point if you're hiking with kids. Some of the power boaters bring in canopies and big tents and even floating islands and rafts and all kinds of stuff. But right beyond that, it gets really quiet. It's fairly cold, big, deep mountain lake. And then you strike off through the wilderness to Muskrat Lake, where there's an old log cabin ruin left by a trapper. And the trapper who went to Muskrat Lake and built this cabin, I'm sure he was not trapping muskrat, but rather beaver. I think he probably kind of built this cabin as a monument to his success in conquering the wilderness and the beaver. But since then, the beaver have come back, and they have been chewing down trees, and they have built a dam at the outlet of Muskrat Lake, which raised the lake level 4 feet, inundated the cabin, and destroyed it. And you're thinking, here's a case where the beavers actually won in the long run. And So the cabin is not habitable anymore, but there is a beaver lodge nearby out in the lake where the beavers built their own defiant lodge as a sign of their victory, evidently over the trapper who tried to clean them out. So a kind of a fun hike. Again, no problem with permits or fires. Now here's one that doesn't have a problem with day hike permits or with fires either, and yet it's on the west side of the Three Sisters Wilderness area near McKenzie Bridge and near Cougar Hot Springs. But I think of it as an island in the wilderness, and that's for two reasons. First is that it's surrounded by clear cuts. This was part of the French Peat addition to the Three Sisters Wilderness, which was a huge controversial battleground in the 60s and 70s when they wanted to add low elevation wilderness with big trees to the Wilderness Act. And the logging industry objected, but they did add a patch at Louder Mountain with some giant old trees. But then, and surrounded on three sides by clear cuts, but then fires came in. And in 2017, one burnt up on one side, and the next year burnt the other side and left Louder Mountain an island in a different way, in that it is a green area surrounded by burns. The fire in 2017 burnt one of the only two fire lookouts that was left in the Three Sisters Wilderness here at Rebel Rock. And that whole hike is still doable, Rebel Creek, but I moved it to the back of the book because it is completely burned. And the Forest Service learned from this after that fire lookout burned, they decided when the next year, when a fire threatened the other fire lookout on O'Lally Mountain, near Louder Mountain, they sent a guy up with Kevlar wrap, and he wrapped it with fireproof paper and left. The fire burned over the whole mountain, but the fire lookout survived. So that you can do that hike too, but again, it's through burnt woods and you get to a fire lookout with a great view, but it's the only thing that didn't burn. So here's French Peat, the creek, before both of the fires. Here it is after the first fire in 2017 that burned down from the south, and the 2018 fire burned down from the north. A lot of the big trees did survive, but it's still kind of black, and so maybe that's a hike you want to do for later after it greens up in a few years. Right nearby is the Cougar Hot Springs, officially known as Terwilliger Hot Springs, probably one of the most popular hot springs in the state. They charge $7 fee to hike this third of a mile trail into these beautiful pools. And you think, well, a hot springs couldn't burn, could it? Well, yeah, actually it's had its share of problems. For an entire year, it was closed because a rock slide covered the only reasonable access road in there. And when they finally reopened that in 2018, within 3 weeks, so many people who had been just like dying to get naked and go into this hot springs rushed up there that they started a fire. And we don't know for sure how that fire started, but they have guards, volunteer guides at the trailhead and at the hot springs to make sure that you don't light up a joint. Because, no drugs or alcohol at the hot springs. And yet the fire started halfway between those two checkpoints. And what do you bet? It was somebody who lit up some marijuana and tossed it aside, and because that's where the fire started. And it did burn up the whole trail. And then the flaming lichen that was blowing away from the burning trees blew across the reservoir and started a fire over near Louder Mountain. But that fire did not get up to the top or any of the route of this hike. So again, no day hike permit problems, but you do need one if you're gonna go overnight. So the trail starts out for 2 miles, mostly level through these meadows on a slope. And then you switch back up to the top of Louder Mountain, which is this plateau. And you have to bushwhack a little bit to get to the viewpoint. And I don't usually include a lot of bushwhacking in my hiking guides unless I think it's pretty doable, and this one is. So you start out on this mostly level trail through these meadows. And this is a place where you'd see columbine and all these great Western Oregon wildflowers, and then switch back up to the summit plateau, which is kind of a desert. And that's weird because it's in this rainforest, but it's been blasted with pumice and ash from eruptions at the Three Sisters for thousands of years. And so I think the summit here is like 50 feet of ash. And so it's very difficult for trees and plants to get started. And the bushwhack you have to do is from where this picture is taken to those trees in the background. It's like 500 feet. It's not very far, but it's not hard to do. But why would you do it? What's so special about those trees? Well, if you get to those trees over there, you see it's just one row of trees, and beyond it is a 1,000-foot cliff overlooking these two gorgeous jewel-like lakes. And in front of you are the Three Sisters. It is a breathtaking viewpoint on the top of Louder Mountain, where you can see that it was an island surrounded by old clear cuts that are gradually regrowing, and by fires that are gradually regrowing as well. Now, if you want to avoid the whole permit issue, go south. Waldo Lake and the Diamond Peak Wilderness don't have any permits problems. They do have a few fires zones, but even those actually are interesting. And I'm going to recommend one that had a fire 24 years ago at the north end of Waldo Lake. This is this 8-mile-long lake. It's the second largest natural lake in Oregon and maybe the purest in the world. And things have regrown a lot. You actually start at the North Waldo campground, which did not burn, so that's green. And for a 2-mile loop with kids, you could just go into the edge of this old burn and take a look at it. But if you've got the energy, you really should go to the outlet of Waldo Lake, Dam Camp. This is actually one of the sources of the Willamette River there, the outlet, the only outlet of Waldo Lake. And it's a lake that has no inlets. There are basically no creeks. It's at the summit of the Cascades. So all of its water comes from snowmelt and rain. And if you do have energy, then go into the burn and do this loop past Lake Kiowa and the Rigdon Lakes. So here we are at the trailhead at North Waldo Lake, which is green, it didn't burn. And this is also a place that you could start the loop trail around Waldo Lake, the Jim Weaver Loop. This is a 20-mile loop that's open to mountain bikes. Now, mountain bikes are not allowed in the wilderness in the backcountry behind Waldo Lake, but they are allowed on this 20-mile loop trail around the lake. And they mostly go clockwise, and that's good to keep them going clockwise so they don't run into each other. So this is kind of the end of of their loop. You don't see that many mountain bikers really, but you might see a few. And then to your left as you're hiking out there, you'll have this fabulously clear lake. It may be the clearest lake in the world. They have a way of measuring the clarity of lakes. It's called a Secchi disc. It's a black and white disc, metal disc that they lower down on a piano wire from a boat and see how far down it goes in the water before they lose sight of it. And in a lot of lakes, it's like 8 or 10 feet. But in Waldo Lake, it's 100 feet. You can see fish 100 feet down, but there aren't many fish. And that's because Waldo Lake is so pure that there's not much for them to eat. And the Forest Service actually stocked Waldo Lake for years by dropping fish from airplanes and to give anglers something to catch. Well, half of those fish died on impact and the other half starved. And the Forest Service finally gave up doing that when people complained that all they were doing was polluting the lake. So you don't plan on fishing at Waldo Lake, but they also have banned motors on the lake, except for small electric motors, and aircraft, so no float planes. It's really a lake for sailboats and kayaks and canoes and hikers. And you can see here how the burn has regrowing with 2 of the pioneer plants, the pink fireweed and then the white pearly everlasting in the foreground. It gets its name because it dries very well, makes great dried flower arrangements. So it still looks pearly when it's everlasting. Well, you want to hike through the burn here to get to Dam Camp. And there, I guess there was an old dam there, but it's not a very small one. And they still have a regulating station, sort of, I guess, measures the height of the outflow. But that's the Willamette River you're seeing there, the main part of the Middle Fork Willamette River, or North Fork Willamette River. And Dam Camp itself is a little campsite. You don't need a permit there. You're looking across the lake to Maiden Peak. You can actually arrange a shuttle if you have somebody with a canoe or kayak that can bring your tents. You can meet here. But this is the place to go in August and September for huckleberries. Nowhere in Oregon have I seen them so big and so thick. They're just amazing. The other thing that is thick and amazing and big there are mosquitoes, which is why you do not go to Waldo Lake in August or even early July. I mean, you don't go in July. You can go in August, but not July. This is kind of frustrating too, because your partners may go online and say, hey, look, there's free campsites available. They're open at Waldo Lake on the 4th of July weekend. Where else in Oregon can you go get a campsite reservation on that weekend? And that's because you don't want to go there then. The mosquitoes are so big, they will carry you away. They unzip the tent fly and come in and poke you. They're huge. So you wait until August. And really, you need to wait till the second week of August when the mosquitoes are gone, and then the huckleberries are out. And if you do this loop, then you can come back by Lake Kiowa and Rigdon Lakes. It's kind of hot and dry there, but I think scenic and interesting. The last hike I want to take you on is one of the few places you can see all of Waldo Lake at once. And this is a pair of cinder cones that overlook the lake. They're called the Twins. And for years, I just described the trail that goes up the Twins. It goes up the North Twin. And this is like 3 miles up and back. But now there are some loop options, new trails that make some loops interesting and possible. For one thing, there's a trail that goes over to the other summit. Its view is not quite as good, but you can go over there. And then there is an illegal mountain bike path that connects over to the east. Now, I rarely include illegal shortcut trails. You shouldn't do this. But this one is really well built and well designed, and it's in exactly the right place. If you do take it, then it makes possible a loop around the Twins. And then on the way back, you can pick up the Pacific Crest Trail and throw in a visit to Bobby Lake. And there is a new 1-mile mountain bike trail that just opened that makes possible a loop there too. So you can do 2 loops. So here's our first. We're going up to South Twin, past this the white bark pines at Timberline, and we get our view of all of Waldo Lake. And here we're looking from North Twin over to South Twin, and you can see the trail switch packing up to that. But then angling down to the left is this illegal mountain bike path. It's actually a really good shape, and it's not very far, 0.2 of a mile, and then you can come back on a loop. If you do pick up the Pacific Crest Trail and want to do the other loop over to Bobby Lake, you'll wind up seeing PCT hikers. They're interesting too. Every 10 or 15 minutes, you'll pass another guy who's either heading to Canada or heading to Mexico. They go both ways now, and they're always interesting to talk to. At Bobby Lake itself, there's 50 good campsites in the woods around this lake. And you don't need advanced reservations. You don't need a permit. If you hike straight into Bobby Lake, it's like 2 miles dead level. A kid could do this. In fact, it's a great first backpack if you're going with small children, because right next to all these campsites is this swimming rock that goes right down into the lake, and kids can sunbathe there or run down into the water, splash around, have a good time. There weren't any problems with fires or permits. This is a place you can go and have fun. And you know, that's really the point of my books. I cover 1,000 trails in Oregon. 19 of the ones near Bend are limited now. don't cry about them. And you could still do them if you want, but try some of the others. And in these days, when we're getting used to social distancing and we're dealing with the effects of fires and crowding and viruses and all these things, it's more important than ever to spread out, to find some new trails. Do not go to the top 3 trails that are listed on social media. Everybody else that's on Facebook and Twitter will be there too, and they'll all be staring at their phones. Instead, try something new. And Oregon has this amazing diversity. I mean, where else on the planet can you go on one tank of gas from a coastline this beautiful, that's all in public ownership, to mountains with glaciers, and on the same tank of gas wind up in what looks like the Sahara Desert, but is the John Day fossil beds of Eastern Oregon. I think that kind of beauty and diversity gives us opportunity, but I think it also gives us a responsibility to learn about these places and protect them, because there are places that are fragile. I do not describe petroglyphs that you can drive to in my book, because I found that if people can drive there, they will wind up destroying them, shooting them up. And the only ones I describe are ones you have to hike at least a half a mile to. And I found that that actually works, that people who are willing to walk a ways, get off the beaten path, are more respectful of nature and our heritage. I grew up in Oregon with the belief that being told that you should leave a campsite in as good shape as you found it. And I think that is true of a state as well. And this is difficult now that so many people are moving to Oregon, often because of the recreation, and often to Bend and Central Oregon Cascades because of the recreation. And you wind up with restrictions, but there's ways around that. And one of them is to walk the extra mile, to go to a different place, to try a trail that's less traveled. And especially in these times, I think it's important to do that. And that's why I write these books, really, is to give you other options. And yeah, even if you can't get the copy of the book at the library, I have all my books now available on Kindle as well. And so you could download them there and then do some exploring. And maybe I've given you a bit of a help by getting you started with some new hikes in the Central Oregon Cascades. And that's my talk. And thank you so much for coming and joining us for this Deschutes Public Library presentation about new hikes in the Central Oregon Cascades with me, Bill Sullivan.
Thank you so much, Bill, for sharing your prodigious knowledge of Oregon's trails and showing us new places we can enjoy. It's evident that you love our state, and we love it too. So thank you. And thank you to all of you watching. If you would like information on updated trail conditions or to ask Bill a question, please go to his website at OregonHiking.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you.